When we come back, words, 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 young poets in Canada.
He was too fast Friday nights after 12 cans when he drove her home. His construction hands. She loathed the green vinyl inside, the windows that wouldn't roll down.
Most people haven't read a book of poetry since they left school, and who would buy a book of poetry when Judith Krantz and John Grisham are competing for your dollars? Poetry does not climb up the bestseller lists the same way as blockbuster novels do, but poetry is alive and it's thriving in Canada. People are buying it and they're reading it. Last year, nearly 200 books of poetry were published, and there are about 3,000 in print today.
Three of those young poets are with us now to talk about why they are poets and about poetry in general. Lesley-Anne Bourne is in Charlottetown. She's had one book of poetry published called The Story of Pears. Michael Redhill is in Toronto. His third book of poems, Lake Nora Arms, will be out this fall. And Jay Ruzesky in Victoria has one book of poems out called Am I Glad to See You? Well, guys, am I glad to see you?
Hi, Tina.
Thanks for joining us today. Lesley-Anne, you know, we were debating this in the office, what makes a poet? I mean, why are you a poet, or did you have no choice? Did poetry choose you?
I think that in a way I had no choice. Poetry was something that just came fairly naturally, or I thought it did, and then I realized you really have to work at it and you really have to revise. And by that time, I realized it was much easier to do that with poetry than with fiction. So I decided to stay with poetry. But there are times where it really does just take over. And so it's not something that I choose. It just comes to me.
Now, were you a tortured adolescent who felt that they had to express themselves on paper?
Probably. I can hear my parents going, yeah, yeah, that was her.
You can hear me going, yeah, yeah, too.
Well, were you, Michael or Jay, were you tortured adolescents?
No, I tortured Lesley.
Michael was a tortured adolescent. He was. Yeah. I think Jay was perfectly normal, though.
No, I don't think so. I think it's a prerequisite of being any kind of an artist that you have to have had a real troubled youth. At least I was fat and I had really short haircuts that my dad made me get when it wasn't fashionable. And that made me think about the society in a whole new way.
But do you feel, I mean, Michael, is there a certain marginality attached to poetry that in a way you have to feel yourself to be an outsider a bit?
I'm not sure that you choose it. I think as time goes on, you realize that poetry is marginalized. But I think the choice to write it it's not conscious. I don't think you go, oh good, nobody's going to read me.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Let's write some.
I'm sure not. But this gets at one of the central conflicts about poetry in a way, or maybe it's not an issue for you, but surely there's a constant tension between the known fact that poetry is never going to be, you know, the Daniel Steele bestsellers, and yet it's what you want to do. I mean, Michael, do you struggle with that, or do you just accept it?
It's not an issue for me because like Lesley was saying, it chose her. I mean, after a while, you stop fighting an impulse that, I mean, if you have financial reasons for wanting to be more successful, then I guess you eventually veer away from poetry and into something else like law. But I'm not concerned with the readership because for me it's relative. I mean, in the theater they say that you have, if 10% of your audience walks out understanding what you said, then you've done your job. And in poetry, maybe it's less than that. But if I'm speaking to those people and they're understanding what I'm saying, then I've done my job.
Jay, what do you think?
Well, yeah, but I think that if you just touch one person with something that you've written, maybe the thing is that with poetry, you've really touched them. You know, you might move them in a significant way, and even if that's only happening to one person, that's enough.
Yeah.
Well, isn't the relationship essentially private? You know, you have one reader with their one nightlight and the book.
That's what I like about it. I like thinking that I'm saying something that I want someone to hear, but I'm not sure I want the whole world to hear it.
So you actually like the exclusionary aspect, Lesley-Anne,
I do. I do very much.
Oh dear, I hope that doesn't mean we're all snobs, does it?
I don't know. I don't think you should confuse that with it being an elite form, because I don't believe that it is. I think that it's a private form. Its intention is to speak directly.
Yeah, I agree. You know, I mean, it's just a quieter way of changing the world. What politicians do doesn't really, often doesn't really have an effect, but a lot of people notice. And maybe what poets do isn't noticed so much, but perhaps has a more significant effect sometimes.
I love that train whistle on the background. It gives such an evocative sense to what you're saying.
Yeah, we got the train here going through.
I wanted to ask you each to read some of your poetry, and Michael, I'll start with you. You've got one from your collection called Lake Nora Arms, and the poem is called Bedtime Haiku. Now, do you want to tell us anything about it, or do you want to just dive right in?
I'll just dive right in.
Okay, go ahead.
The poem's called Bedtime Haiku. Dual pools of light. We're reading our books silently. Car's Doppler outside. And then you drift off. Such a sad foreknowledge. I wish you'd keep reading.
Now, that's lovely, and that does have the intimacy that you were... Is that what you were talking about, that this is a poem that you've written for one person?
Well, the voice in the poem is speaking to one person. And yet the space of the poem is small and intimate. I mean, I wonder what the effect would be to read it to a room full of people. I mean, they would all have to do the work of imagining themselves under that one light in that one room.
But I guess that's the magic of poetry, isn't it? That's exactly where you land a person. I mean, the person is exactly in that situation.
If it works, it stops time.
Yeah, what a lovely thought. Lesley-Anne, you're going to read for us as well?
Yes, I am.
Okay, tell me what you're reading from your collection, and it's what, called The Orange Canoe?
Yes.
Okay.
I scooped night into the orange canoe. The blue boathouse light drifts alongside slowly. Calm except for this canoe, the paddle entering like your voice again, the thought of it, into the water, tugging.
Now, that's also quite lovely and evocative, and I mean,
Thanks.
I hope this isn't, you know, an awful thing to say, but I actually see a similarity between the two poems. Lesley-Anne, what do you think? I mean, it has the same kind of very intimate flavor.
Well, Michael and I have a lot of things in common.
Oh, yes? Care to share them?
We're only going to share some of them.
them.
And one of them is he has a cottage very close to my cottage. And we both grew up around lakes in Muskoka and Gravenhurst. We've also worked with some of the same poets as editors. Like, our editor is the same person sometimes. And Michael and I also show each other our writing, or we used to, and we used to help each other write.
Okay, Jay, we haven't heard from you yet. You're also going to read from it for us from your collection.
Right.
The poem is The Amelioration of Summer, and we should say this is just a fragment you're giving us.
Yeah, this is just the first stanza. How we talk sometimes in hopefulness. It amazes me you can turn the darkest clouds inside out with words. You've said, not ends, beginnings. We choose who we become and leave ourselves behind.
Now, may I commit the greatest, you know, hideous faux pas and ask you what you're trying to tell us there?
What I'm talking about?
Yes.
Well, I picked that this morning because it maybe is not so much what I was writing about, but what I'm thinking about now. And it has to do with what I sense going on generally, you know, in the world around me, that this is the end of an age of rationalism, and what we need to do in some ways if we're going to sort of move on into the next century and so forth is to not just think analytically and rationally, but also intuitively.
Yeah. Michael, you know, as a person who reads poetry from time to time, I often feel about it that it's meant to kind of, you know, detonate afterwards.
Yeah.
That you read about it, and then, you know, sometime later, the sort of little revelation
comes. Yeah,
comes.
that's a great image. I mean, a poem can be an idea in pill form, you know. You take it and you can wait for an effect. I mean, it can explode afterwards. It can get into your bloodstream, into your mind, that way.
Now, does poetry have a future? I mean, obviously, here you are, all in your 20s, making a living. Well, in fact, maybe we should ask this. Can one make a living doing it? I know you do other things, Michael.
I'm also a playwright and a go-go dancer.
I knew it was those boots. But can one make a living being a poet? I mean, do poets have to starve?
I think it's a cliche to say that you have to starve and suffer. I think that, like anyone trying to make a living, you have to scramble about and keep your wits about you. And I do different things, and we're very lucky in this country to have a generous granting system at the federal and provincial levels. So I get by. Not just writing poetry, but I do get by.
Lesley-Anne?
There's no way I could survive on my poetry. And I don't know very many people who can, but poetry is going to survive anyway because we find a way to keep writing poetry. Maybe it's by doing other jobs. I teach at the University of Prince Edward Island, and that allows me to be a poet and to keep writing.
And Jay, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I also have a, I have a teaching job, and that's a sort of traditional route to support the pleasure of writing. But I agree with Lesley, poetry is going to survive anyway. There will always be people who read it, and maybe it'll become more necessary. There's so much information out there, poetry has to compete with it. But I think it's doing that. There are no less readers now than there were before.
Now, can I ask you, we talked so much earlier on about this tension between, who reads you and who doesn't. I mean, Lesley-Anne, would you be actually unhappy if you suddenly became wildly popular and everybody started reading you on the subway?
To be honest, no. I think I'd be thrilled. At the same time, though, I would be nervous. I would feel a little self-conscious that, and this is odd for a writer to say, but I don't want people to really know that much about me. So when people have told me that they've read my book, part of me is really thrilled because that's what I want. The other part of me thinks, oh my God, they've read my book.
What do they know about me? Yeah, well, I want to thank all three of you with sharing some of your intimate poetry with us today. Thanks for joining us. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you very much, Tina.
Happy reading.
Bye-bye.
When we come back, Tom New reviews Mike Myers' new movie.
Tony, have you heard of this? Mrs. X. She murders her husbands on their honeymoons, then changes her identity and marries again.
Oh, I never heard of it. So what?
I think I'm dating Mrs. X.